All right, next lesson, Chapter 6, Lesson 3. We're talking about amendments still. We've gotten past the first 10, the Bill of Rights. Hoorah! Why was the Bill of Rights added to the Constitution, Abigail?
Because they wanted, or the anti-federalists felt like it was necessary to establish, like, what rights people did have.
Absolutely right. The Federalists, of course, supported the Constitution as is. They thought a Bill of Rights was unnecessary and potentially harmful. They thought all those rights were already adequately covered by the Constitution itself and by state constitutions. The Anti-Federalists said, no, we fear big, strong, powerful government, and we're suspicious of any kind of government that is not given, basically, limits to its power. So that's why we have the Bill of Rights. A compromise between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists to get the Constitution ratified, which is what? Officially accepted by the states. So we went through the first 10 amendments. Now we're going to look kind of at the rest of them. We got 27 total, of course. But we're going to really focus on a handful of amendments that are all about furthering our civil liberties. What do you think furthering civil liberties means?
Giving people more extensive freedoms.
More extensive freedoms and rights. We're going to see some more amendments that give the citizens more rights. And there's some hints right here what these more rights are going to be. What do you think some of these more rights are going to be, Abigail, just on these pictures here?
The right for African Americans to vote.
Yep.
To exist in society
Yep.
like everyone else does.
Sure.
Maybe the right for women to vote.
We're going to see that most of these amendments we're going to focus on give American citizens more rights, and it's going to be focusing on those things that gave people the vote. We're going to talk about the African Americans being freed from slavery in the 13th Amendment, and then the 14th and 15th, they give them more rights to include the right to vote. We're going to talk about the 19th Amendment that gave women the right to vote. Huge, literally doubling the amount of citizens that could participate in the voting process, which is a key civil liberty and a key part of our democracy. We're also going to see things like 18-year-olds getting the right to vote. Once upon a time, the people who lived in Washington, D.C. did not get the right to vote for president. So we're going to see increasing civil liberties, but with the big and major focus on how American citizens became more able to exercise their freedoms through the right to vote. All right. This isn't a history class, but we got to talk about some history. 1860 in the United States, slavery existed. It was generally no slaves in the northern states, lots of slaves in the southern states. The northern states either didn't have slaves or had laws against slavery. The southern states, as you probably know from your history, slavery was not only common, but it was a huge part of the southern economy. As the United States grew and more territories started being settled, and these territories were going to become states, the issue of slavery got more and more severe. The South started to really worry that the North, in this new political party called the Republican Party, were going to make all these new states free states, constrict slavery, and potentially make slavery illegal and take it away from the South. So when the first Republican gets elected to the presidency in 1860, and who was this guy?
Lincoln.
Abraham Lincoln gets elected to president in 1860. Before he could even leave Illinois and head to Washington, D.C. to start doing the things he needed to do to turn over the presidency and become inaugurated, the South is freaking out. And almost immediately, southern states start talking about and then actually seceding. What does it mean to secede? Not succeed, secede.
To like break away
To
from.
break away, to leave. So, slavery was such a huge part of the South, its economy and its culture, that with the election of Lincoln, who is a Republican, the anti-slavery party, the South secedes. It breaks away. it becomes its own country. It is no longer the United States of America, it's the Confederate States of America. Lincoln at this point has a decision to make. Lincoln potentially could have said, bye-bye South, you form your own country, we'll be the United States up here in the north, you could be the Confederate States in the south, and there's no longer one nation here. We're two different nations, just like the US and Canada, or Germany and France. Of course, Lincoln doesn't make that decision. He says, no, South, you're not allowed to break away from the rest of the country. So we fight the war, called the United States Civil War. Usually we just call it the Civil War. Cool. Take a look at these as you see the slideshow. They're advertisements for human beings, if you can imagine that. This is common in a normal part of your life, particularly if you live in the South, that you buy and sell other human beings, and just like we advertise things today, human beings were advertised for sale in the beginning of our country's history. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but there's going to be a couple of slides coming up. I am not a history class, but I do want to just address a little bit of history. It's not unusual for some people to argue that the Civil War was not about slavery. They'll argue that if slavery was involved at all, it's only one of several reasons why the South broke away. They'll cite states' rights, and they'll cite differences over tariffs and taxes and business issues. Great. And they'll either de-emphasize the role in slavery in the Civil War or list it as completely not part of the Civil War. But the problem is you could read about what they said back then, why they seceded. It wasn't a mystery because some people had to sell breaking away from the United States to their own people or other states. Some southern states were reluctant to secede. So the states that were very pro-slavery, South Carolina, for example, they basically send ambassadors to the other southern states and say, you need to secede with us. Because the South didn't break away as a block on all together at the same second. One of the people you could read is the Vice President of the Confederate States. He explains why the Confederacy split away from the United States. And he makes no bones about it. He doesn't say tariffs and states' rights. He says the primary reason we are seceding from the United States is due to slavery. Cornerstone speech, you can read about it if you care to, explaining on behalf of the Confederacy as its vice president why they did it. And then the states, as they seceded, explained why they did it. Some didn't say a lot. Some basically just have a one-paragraph thing say we're splitting away. Other states write these long and fairly specific reasons why they split. South Carolina makes no bones about it. We're leaving the United States because of slavery. Texas is similar. Texas does list some reasons why it leaves, but its primary and the first reason why it says it's leaving the United States is about slavery. So, do some research. Hopefully you'll cover this more in 8th grade in a U.S. history class. But as you sit and you hear people around you talk about the United States history and you hear somebody say the Civil War was not about slavery, please review some of this stuff and see what the people who were living then said why they were doing what they were doing. Cool. We won't talk about the Civil War. 1861 through 1865. It ends in 1865 when the Confederate military surrenders to the United States military at a place called Appomattox Courthouse, and two of the most famous generals at that time in the blue is Ulysses S. Grant, who at the time was basically the commander-in-chief of the United States military, and he's accepting the surrender of General Robert E. Lee, who was the senior commander of the Confederate military. Terrible, bloody war, because Whatever else you want to say about that war, casualties on both sides were, frankly, Americans. So it is the most costly war in the United States history. But it ends in 1865. Now the country has to reform. And part of the country coming back together in a process called Reconstruction, we have to get rid of slavery. So the 13th Amendment is going to do that. The 13th Amendment is going to end slavery. Bottom line, slavery is gone. This institution that impacted millions of people in the South and is basically the cornerstone of the Southern economy is wiped out forever by amending the Constitution, the law of the land. Unfortunately, though, that's not going to solve all the problems. Don't think that the slaves were freed and it's like, all right, everybody, this is cool. I welcome you as a fellow citizen with the same rights that I have. Of course, you know that didn't happen in 1865, and you could argue that isn't effective here in 2021 with some people. So we're going to have these three amendments called the Civil War or Reconstruction Amendments that address this process of pulling slavery out of the country and start giving African Americans equal rights as their white fellow citizens. 13th Amendment ends slavery. The 14th Amendment basically says, hey, no kidding. These people are citizens and they get the same due process and protections as every other citizen in the United States. Because they weren't getting it, particularly in the southern states, and we'll talk about that. And the 15th Amendment says, hey, no kidding. African American men only, sorry women, African American men only do have the right to vote. You could look back at this period and say, well, the 14th and 15th Amendments never should have to been written. As soon as we ended slavery, it should have been as simple as they're no longer slaves, they're citizens, they get all the rights and protections to include the right to vote, but no. We'll see, particularly in the South, as soon as these slaves were freed, Southerners and Southern state governments automatically start trying to put barriers in front of their fellow citizens, their fellow African American citizens, to prevent them from having jobs, controlling where they lived, and of course, as we see with the 15th Amendment, not giving African Americans full voting rights. 13th Amendment, take time to read the verbiage, ends slavery. Bam, period. 13th Amendment ends slavery. Now we're going to see there's a little thing in there that says, well, you can force people to work if they're convicted criminal. So that's how you have people who go to prison, and when they go to prison, they may be required to work there. That has its little exception in there. But the 13th Amendment, the thing you want to remember, one of the Civil War Reconstruction Amendments, 1865, slavery is gone, wiped out in the United States. 14th Amendment follows pretty closely after it in 1868. The Republican Party in the United States government saw that the southern states were struggling with giving African Americans full civil rights and civil liberties. And the individual southern states were restricting the rights of their African American citizens through these things called black codes. The states would write in state laws things that prevented African Americans from being able to get jobs, to live in certain places, to have certain professions, and as we'll see, prevent them from being able to vote. So the 14th Amendment tries to fix that. The 14th Amendment says, hey, no kidding. Hey, America, African Americans are full citizens with full citizenship rights. Period. African Americans get the full protection and due process of the law. So due process is in both the 5th Amendment and the 14th Amendments. So remember that when you hear about due process. Due process means every citizen gets every single protection that the law allows in every single case and opportunity. Questions?
What's the difference between black codes and Jim Crow laws, or are they the same thing just with different names?
I bet a good historian will say they're similar but not exactly the same. Yeah, I'll do some more research and see specifically why would you call some things Jim Crow and why would you call some things black codes. Good question. And I'll think about that as I'm lecturing, and I'll Google it later, and I'll try to put something in there to clear that up. As far as civics in 7th grade in the state of Florida, the term that's used in the books is going to be the black codes. These are state laws written primarily in southern states that would restrict the rights of African Americans. Here's an example of a black code written in state law in Louisiana. Basically say you can't buy a house. And this is why the 14th Amendment is passed to say, no, you can't restrict the due process and rights of these citizens because they're African Americans. Political cartoon at the time. It's not the clearest. This is an African American couple here. Looks like husband and wife. And what do we see in the rest of this cartoon? What do we think's going on?
Got a soldier and someone from the KKK.
Mm-hmm.
And it looks like they both have weapons. There's someone hanging from a tree in the background.
Mm-hmm.
So probably lynching.
Exactly. It's hard to see what it says here, but this says worse than slavery.
Yeah.
So this was a political cartoon hitting at black codes. Abby's describing the very important parts here. The only thing I'd change, this is not a soldier. Now it looks like, because it looks like he's wearing a uniform and it's got a rifle with a bayonet. Who does that except soldiers, but we'll talk about that in a second. Easier, of course, is the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. It's pretty much as soon as the Civil War ends, the South is being told by the U.S. government that it has to get rid of slavery. Now, these Southerners are not like, oh, yeah, you're right, we lost the war, you got it, good, great. Yeah, slavery is gone. Hello, free African Americans, you're my equal citizen. Of course, they don't do that. Almost immediately, in southern states, terrorist groups are formed, like the Ku Klux Klan. And these were called various different names, white leagues, rifle companies, but functionally, illegal terrorist state militias that only had one kind of goal: fight against Reconstruction and oppress African American citizens. And particularly, if they did one thing, it was keep African Americans from voting. So they'd use murder and terror to oppress African American citizens and specifically keep them from voting. Because why? If you vote, what do you have? Political power. Now you can make the system in the way it suits you, okay? So as soon as the Civil War ends, the legal side of it, states made these things called black codes, and then on the other side, terrorist groups form up with the whole idea of making sure that African American citizens did not get to enjoy their full rights. And back here, yes, that's a person who is lynched. If you can't see it very well, it's a figure basically hanging from the neck from a tree. Lynching is a murder, but it's usually a murder where citizens murder another citizen, sometimes because they accuse them of a crime, and they sometimes will pull them out of a jail and just basically murder them. And a lot of these terrorist groups and the citizens that supported them would do this to African American men. They'd accuse them of crimes and then basically murder them in all different sorts of ways, but the stereotypical way they would lynch somebody is by hanging.
And that's what they tried to do in To Kill a Mockingbird, like in the movie, if anyone has seen it. Like Atticus sits outside the jail so no one will come and take the prisoner and try to lynch him.
Exactly. Yeah, and lynching didn't end here in the 1870s with the 13th, 14th, and the 15th Amendment. Lynching goes on through the 1960s, through the Civil Rights era, and some people say it's still used occasionally sometimes, as almost a terrorist tool against African Americans or other minorities, even LGBT sometimes. Questions. So the 14th Amendment is there to fix these things, particularly strike down these black codes to make sure African Americans get to practice their full citizenship rights. So first it says, hey, guess what? If you're born or naturalized in the United States, you're a citizen. Because one of the arguments the southern states would use against African Americans, well, they're not citizens, so I don't have to give them rights. And the Constitution's going to say, no, if you're born here or naturalized, you are a citizen, full stop. Which goes all the way back to the first stuff we learned in this course about citizenship. Each state must give all citizens equal protection of the laws, due process. Every citizen, whether they're black or white, gets equal protection. Due process, equal protection under the laws. Huge stuff. Keep that in your brain. 14th Amendment, citizenship, and 14th Amendment, every citizen gets equal protection under laws and full due process. Get Low versus New York. This is probably something you won't see in the EOC, but it is in your textbook and it is in your quiz. Originally, people in the United States understood that the Bill of Rights only applied to the federal government. So the Bill of Rights only limit the power of the federal government. The Supreme Court, who get to say what the Constitution says, in 1925 says, no. The Constitution applies to the federal government and to state governments. This is going to be important because this is one more thing that breaks down these southern states, which continuously argue from the Civil War through the Civil Rights era that they're allowed to have their own laws, which include these laws that are specifically targeted against African Americans. Particularly these black codes or Jim Crow laws that really attack the ability of African Americans to enjoy full rights, and particularly the right to vote. Gitlow versus New York. 15th Amendment, African American males have the right to vote. Not females. Unfortunately, females are going to have to wait 60 more years practically. They're not going to get the right to vote till 1919. And when you look at the history, women's suffrage people who supported the right for women to vote fought and really worked hard to have the 15th Amendment have African Americans and all women of all races being able to vote too. But that got shot down in 1870, which shows you how politically crazy women's rights was, that we're trying to fix these historical inequalities in our country's system. And we're going to say, all right, yes, no kidding, African American men can vote, but they couldn't make that extra leap in 1870 to say yes, and women can vote too. To me, it's just craziness.
Yeah, it is, because like they've been enslaved for so long, but then basically right out the jump they get their rights to vote. I mean, it takes a bit, but then these women that have been accepted as citizens for so long, they still don't get the right to vote for.
Right.
I'm not saying that's a bad thing, like that they got the right to vote, but it's still like weird the thought process that they went to justify it.
It's just, to me, in 2021, and it is 2021 now, it's hard for me to really come to grips how the majority of societies, and not just American society, across the world, but in a place where all men are created equal and we take such pride in the idea that we enjoy our liberties, women aren't considered full citizens and don't get the right to vote until 1919. Long after African American men get the right to vote. Crazy. So to review, you'll hear these called the Civil War Amendments or Reconstruction Amendments. 13th Amendment does what?
Free slaves.
14th Amendment does what?
Say, yeah, you gotta actually free the slaves and give them all the rights.
Yep. It says everybody who's born or naturalized here is a citizen, and you have to give equal protection under the law and full due process to all your citizens, to include these people who used to be slaves just a few years earlier. And 15th Amendment?
Right for African American men to vote.
And women?
No.
You're gonna have to wait. A note on here, 15th Amendment's 1870, but as you see here, it's really going to take another 100 years after that, till the 1960s, for full civil rights for African American citizens, to include fixing all these voting barriers. Yeah, it's terrible. All right. We're going to really just go really fast through here. The 17th Amendment says you get to vote for your senators directly. That means me, I'm a citizen in 1912. I didn't get to vote for my senators. Then how did senators get picked? State legislatures would pick the U.S. senators. So if I'm a Florida state legislator in Tallahassee in 1912, one of the things I do is I vote for the 2 senators that Florida's going to get in the United States Congress. I'm a citizen, I didn't get that chance to vote for my senators. I would vote for my representative. I would vote for president, but my senators were picked by the people I vote for who sat in the state capitol in Tallahassee. This changes that and says now as a Florida voter and citizen, I get to vote for my senators directly.
So directly, did whoever just had the majority take the seat?
That's a great question. There's no such thing as like an electoral college equivalent, if that's what you're asking. But I couldn't tell you how 50 different states did it. My guess would be the state legislatures had basically a straight up winner takes all direct vote on the senators, but that's another thing I would have to Google. Great question. But there are no electoral colleges for anybody other than the president. When I vote for my mayor, I'm voting for the mayor. When I vote for my representative, I vote directly for that representative. When I vote for senator, I vote directly for that senator. It's only the presidency where I vote and hope my state has enough votes where somebody wins and then those state electors vote for that presidential candidate.
So would the presidential election still be a direct election, or would it sort of be an indirect election?
With regards to what?
Like in regards to the votes, like because you're not really directly voting for your candidate, you're voting for the electoral college.
In our system, I don't directly vote for president. I vote for the name Joe Biden or Donald Trump. Then I wait, and then if my candidate, Donald Trump, gets 51% of the vote in the state of Florida, Donald Trump is supposed to get Florida's 29 electors in the electoral
Yeah,
college.
so it's an indirect
It
election.
is indirect.
Okay.
And that's exactly how it was set up by the framers. For good or ill, they decided for several reasons, one of which being the whole, have you met American citizens? A lot of them are knuckleheads. Do you want knuckleheads picking our president? No, we're going to create this second tier of people who are going to be the ones that actually vote for the president. Other issues too, why people support the electoral college, and the typical one is if you just went with a popular vote only, guess who gets to pick the president? New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Washington, D.C. San Diego and Los Angeles. Why? Because that's where everybody lives. Who's going to care about South Dakota or Wyoming? Because nobody lives there, right? So that's another reason why people like the Electoral College. They think it gives the smaller states with the smaller populations a better chance of having an impact on a presidential election. 17th Amendment, though, I bet you a hot pocket, you won't see it in the EOC. But it is about voting rights and civil liberties. I could vote directly for my senator. Here's the big one. 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are, of course, huge. The Civil War Reconstruction Amendments, because they allow African Americans this variety of rights. But if you're just talking about straight up numbers, the 19th Amendment is the biggest numbers-wise. Why? Because it literally doubles the U.S. voting population with that one amendment. So, suffrage is the right to vote. So you sometimes hear this called the women's suffrage movement. Women have fought the entirety of humanity from the formation of the United States until 1919 for the right to vote. And so there's a great and powerful story, what women did to get the right to vote. They even had their own terrorist organizations, some of them who committed terrorist acts. A woman in England who was an English women's suffragist leader, she went to a horse race. And she was standing by the rail of the horse race, and she threw herself in front of the king's horse as a women's voting rights protest, and she got schwacked. She got killed by the king's horse. So these are just some of the things women were doing to gain the right to vote.
It's dedication.
It's dedication. And so the amendment process is what? 2/3 of Congress comes up with the amendment. Women should have the right to vote. And then it goes to the state legislatures, and 3/4 of the states have to ratify it for it to pass. And the 19th Amendment basically comes down to one guy in one state. I can't remember the state now, something like Oklahoma. And the Oklahoma legislature is almost split perfectly in half. And this one young guy, he was like the youngest legislator in the state legislature, he said he was going to vote against this. And before he votes, he gets a letter from his mom. And his mom says, yeah, I'm proud of you, son, and I know you're going to do the right thing. And guess what the right thing is? Allowing women the right to vote. So he ups and changes his vote at the last minute, votes to support the ratification of the 19th Amendment, and that's how close it happened. And the story is, after he voted, everybody was so angry, he wound up running from the rest of his politicians, had to jump out a window to get away from him. Now, when I say this, everybody expects this spectacular leap from, the top of the Nakatomi Plaza, like 40 stories. He was
toppled out of it onto the grass.
he was in the first story, so it wasn't as dramatic as he sounds. But he does have to run away from his fellow politicians. 19th Amendment literally doubles the U.S. voting population by finally giving the women the right to vote. 23rd Amendment, a weird one. We forget about poor Washington, D.C. But when we think about Washington, D.C. in civics, the important thing to remember about Washington, D.C. is it is not a state. So it has these slightly different things that applies to Washington, D.C., which includes, up until the 60s, if you lived in Washington, D.C., you're a full-up U.S. citizen. You might have voted for the mayor of Washington, D.C., but you didn't get to cast a vote for president.
That's so weird.
It is weird, because up to the 60s, the idea was, well, you're not a state. So if you're not a state, you don't get a vote in the Electoral College.
But
and
it's a city, right?
It is.
People in cities can vote.
Yes, but a city like Milton or Pensacola is constructed as a local government as part of the state of Florida. D.C. is different. Washington, D.C. is the District of Columbia. It belongs to no other state. It's its own political entity. So it's run by different laws to this day. But from the 1800s till 1961, if you lived in Washington, D.C., you didn't get to vote for president. The 23rd Amendment changes that. Now, if you live in D.C., you get to vote for president. Cool. Here's where we're still struggling with full liberties for African Americans here in the 1960s. A poll tax. We talk about Jim Crow laws or black codes. These laws that restricted people's rights lasted through the 60s. Once upon a time, a poll tax was money you had to pay your local government or your state government for the right to vote. So before you could vote, you had to pay the poll tax. Great. So now if you're poor, and particularly if you're poor African American, are you going to be able to vote? Not if you can't pay your poll tax. Craziness. So, finally make an amendment to the Constitution saying, hey, these poll taxes are illegal. So, 24th Amendment 1964 says, no more poll taxes. You cannot charge people to vote. Crazy. Trivia. Look at the style of that cartoon. I think, I guess you wouldn't call it a font in the cartoon, but check out the lettering and check out the faces and the hands. Does this look like anybody's work you're probably familiar with?
Dr. Seuss.
Absolutely. Dr. Seuss, the famous cartoonist and writer who did all those children's books. I mean, do you still read these at your age? I know I did as a child, and I know I read them to my children. But you might have heard of Dr. Seuss, One Fish, Two Fish, The Lorax.
Cat in the Hat.
Cat in the Hat is probably the biggest hit. Dr. Seuss didn't just write kids' books. He was a political cartoonist, too. Theodore Geisel, I think his name is.
He wasn't a good person anyways.
Yeah, he had some issues. But he was also a political cartoonist. So, of course, if you don't have the money to vote, your rights are restricted. So this amendment, the 24th, says you can't make somebody pay to vote, poll taxes.
Did they have to pay poll taxes for every election, like mayor, senator, or was it just the presidential election?
Good question.
And were they different amounts?
I don't know. I'd have to research that, so you've given me a lot of work to do. But I would bet they were for all elections. The way it probably works, and what I've seen is, and building these slides, the internet's filled with receipts. So you'd pay your poll tax and you'd get a receipt. And it would be poll tax paid by Abigail Biankowski, $1.50. And it would be signed typically by the county, because it's usually the county that runs elections. And what elections do they run? They run all elections. So my bet is they wanted to restrict your voting rights across the board. Because voting for mayor, you're like, that's not important, that's local. But local elections may be the most important election of your life, right? Does the president really impact you every day? Probably not. But can your city council and your mayor do things that's probably going to impact your life more closely? Sure. So my guess would be poll taxes probably were paid for all the elections that the county ran, but I don't know that for sure. I'd have to check it. Abby's giving me all kinds of homework today. Yeah. Voting age. This is going to be another huge one. By the numbers, probably not as big as the 19th Amendment, which literally doubles the number of voters. But in 1971, with the 26th Amendment, we dropped the voting age from 21 to 18. What's going to be the motivation or the impetus that gets people all fired up that says, hey, we need to address this voting age thing. We shouldn't just have 21-year-olds voting. We should drop it all the way down to adulthood, 18 years old.
What's the reason?
Yeah, what fires up people? What gets people moving towards where they think
They want more votes. They think younger people will vote for what they want. I don't know.
How about focus on this time frame?
Oh, the war.
The war in Vietnam. So it's 1965, 66, 1968. The Vietnam War is raging in Southeast Asia. You would get drafted at 18. So you're 18, 19 years old, hip deep in a swamp in Vietnam, bullets and rockets whistling by you. Your friend gets killed. This guy loses a leg. And you had no say over the matter because you couldn't vote. So a lot of these young American veterans come back to the United States and say, hey, if I could get killed by my government, by fighting my government's wars, I'm a citizen, and that's part of the social contract I make with the government. If I'm accepting the privileges of citizenship, I also have to pay the price, which is being eligible for the draft. But if we're a democracy and a representative democracy, if you're going to get me blowed up in a war, let me at least have a voice in the government through the vote.
So they can get like thrown into war at 18, but they can't drink till they're 21.
Exactly. Well, now that happens. Oh, when I was really young, and it changed. It was the 70s, late 60s, 70s, going into the 80s when drinking ages changed. I think when I was really young, like a child, the drinking age was still 18, but it went up in most states to be 21. And that was through another big political thing, which is drunk driving fatalities. You know, a lot of people were dying at the wheel of young people drinking too much. So that pushed the drinking ages from 18 to 21. And it's an argument people still use today. But yeah, 21 years old to drink. And if you do drink responsibly. And please don't drive. It is horribly dangerous. 26th Amendment, 1971, a reaction to the Vietnam War. If I could get blown to pieces at age 18, 19, give me my civil liberty of being able to pick the government that sends me somewhere to get blown to pieces. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's pretty fair. Questions? Adios, muchachos, muchachas. Keep learning civics.